Well, what we're talking about today is narrative literature. And before we get into some of the details that I have that will be put on the screen, let's talk a little bit about the book. Let's see what kind of information that we have in the book and any comments and questions that you may have. Now you'll notice that the book has two chapters that deal with what we're going to deal with that we call a narrative. One chapter is called narrative and the other chapter is called history. Okay? There's not a whole lot of difference between the two, although there are certainly some differences. Okay? On page 91, just to explain what the differences are, he explains it after he gets out of narrative into history. Page 191, out of the page. 1 or just 90? 91, yeah. What makes history genre distinguishable from narrative? Two main answers in the Old Testament history is national and not familial or tribal. Okay? That's one aspect of it. So we're talking about the nation as a whole, as opposed to familial or within particular families or tribes, as we would have, let's say, in the book of Judges. It is record keeping and not storytelling, though you use some storytelling in history as well. So that's kind of the basic difference. Okay. Now we'll notice that when we get into the how to interpret guidelines, you'll see that there are some differences, but there are some overlap. Okay? So in my notes, I kind of, as I indicated to you, I think I indicated it to you, I did it in my new revised version, that I grouping the two together, if you will, okay, in my notes. So those two different groups. So let's talk about what the book has to say with respect to narrative, first off. And let me ask you any comments that you have in reading that section, that chapter, that impressed you or confused you or helped you. And we'll just kind of walk through it first, but talk to me first.
I know when I'm reading this and I'm considering the author and how he wrote this.
Which author? The book of this author?
The author of the Old Testament. Whatever book, whatever narrative we're talking about.
Biblical author.
Biblical author. Okay. It makes me wonder if that person was writing with the purpose to tell a story or writing with the purpose to communicate events. And going back to that concept of history, and I'm still a little bit struggling on the two, because if the story itself is historical and accurate, then wouldn't that be history?
Yes.
Okay. That's
no, but if the story is focusing on, let's say, on your project, or is on Elisha, and it really doesn't have a national focus, then you classify it as narrative and storytelling as opposed to history. But is it historical? Yes, it's historical. Okay? But the purpose of the writer, if you will, is not to place this within this large and broad national context. Okay? It's a much narrower focus, a different kind of a purpose, no doubt. I don't know if that helps or not.
Oh, well, yeah.
But like I say, there is significant overlap that we're going to see.
And I guess to me it goes back to the motive of the biblical author, of why he's writing this. And
Right. And that's why when you initially, as we shall do, when we begin to work on a particular narrative, okay, one of the first things we have to do, of course, is to do our historical study on the book. And what's the purpose of the book, right? And how does this story or this narrative fit into the picture or the purpose of the book, right? And so on the broad context, you can see how it can potentially fit. But then when we look at it more narrowly as an individual episode in and of itself, we can see some of the storytelling aspects of it. So some of it will be there because of the connection with the broad picture, and some of the detail will be there in this kind of the storytelling mode and have a different purpose, such as a moral or ethical purpose. Anything else on the narrative? It's a pretty good chapter. It's kind of small. I've got 4 or 5 books on the Old Testament narrative that I couldn't bring with me. And so this is pretty limited in how it deals with it, but I should say it pretty much covers a breadth, but not with any great detail.
And this in a sense is more descriptive than prescriptive. You know? They're looking back and noticing the components of narrative.
Right? If I follow your thinking, in other words, they get their rules, if you will, from looking at what they did, applying a set of literary rules to the text to make sure it says it the way the rules say it need to be said. So that's descriptive. And which, of course, one of the books that's in fact, the very first one, page 87, Art of Biblical Narrative by Robert Alter. One of the things that he will emphasize there is the distinctiveness of the Old Testament narrative mode, and we have to be very careful not to impose later literary concepts backwards, if you will. Okay? And he'll show and demonstrate the distinctiveness of the Old Testament narratives. And that's what we got to be careful of. We don't violate that. Anything else? Let's walk through. Do you have anything? You want to comment?
No, I'm looking back at things I would like to see.
Okay.
And I haven't come across anything yet.
Let me point out a few things, and maybe it'll jog your thinking a little bit. Okay. One of the things, of course, on page 71, on that first sentence on the last paragraph, is something that is pretty obvious, but we're not usually thinking in terms of looking at the Old Testament story and say, what are the scenes? See? The task of the interpreter is identify each of the scenes. When we think of reading a story, we're not thinking of the scenes, right? Thinking in those kind of categories to begin with. But so right off, we said we need to kind of examine the scenes involved. Is it different spatial concepts? You see, what are the scenes? Where are they? How would you break that down and separate? And then the scenes kind of relate to one another. You see. So we tend just to kind of read the story and not think in terms of its its breakdown into various scenes which then either relate to one another to tell the whole story. So then we not only have scenes in there, unless they're very small narratives, short I should say, remember exactly what it is on this guy, let's see what was his name, Shamgar was his name in the book of Judges. One verse, I think, is the whole thing. He killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day, and that's the whole scene right there. It's the whole picture. Okay, so when I was reading, working with one that I was working on, I was reading as a scene that follows up, or a story, a section that follows up the passage to be working on later on this evening or tomorrow.
It's Judges 3:31.
Yeah, it's about one verse, right?
Yeah. After him was Shamgar the son of Anak, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's another guy who jumped in a pit and killed a lion somewhere. Let's see, where am I at? It's a section where Elisha, where Elisha had these people come after him, calling him a bald head. Right? I mean, there are only about 4 verses here. I'll look at it later. But it's only about 4 verses, maybe not even that many verses. And he turns around and curses them when the bear comes out and kills them all. And that's the whole thing. You wonder, how in the world does this fit into a big picture, and even a small picture? What is it supposed to tell us? Well, it does fit. It does fit into the larger connected narrative. We'll get to it when I get to my passages we're working on. Now, on page 72, not only do stories have scenes, they have plots. What does that mean by plot? Well, like a middle, beginning, a middle, and an ending. Well, yes, but also there are different parts of that plot, and he lists them for us. Okay? Well, I'll have some. I'll show something where it does list it for us. The plot involves the protagonist, or the primary person, right? Person or persons, antagonists, who are the alternative, if you will, the secondary persons, and then some other potential people who are kind of as a foil to bounce something off and create a focus to something. Okay. But then there's crisis that occurs. You don't have a story if you don't have a crisis of some sort. Okay. And so things lead up to it. By the way, these would be in different scenes, no doubt. So things would lead up to the crisis. Then there would be a point, a peak, a climax, where somehow the crisis is dealt with. And then there's a resolution of all the things that grow out of that whole thing. And then some sort of a potentially conclusion that has a moral or historical or theological value for the big picture. So not only do we need to think in terms of scenes, we need to think in terms of plot, right? Seeing how the plot develops. Okay? It's just like a movie. If we went to a movie, and what are some of the critics? Well, they say it was an interesting movie, but there was no plot, or it was weak on the plot. What they're saying is the story value of it was weak, That's what they're saying. Now, in relationship to this, and we'll work on this a little bit, is the concept of pacing. Okay? There are broad, sweeping movements, and they journey from the wilderness of sin to some other spot. Okay, well, I'm not picking. It might have taken him quite a while to do that, but the narrator just doesn't want to stop there. He just wants to move us to the next spot. Okay, and then some detail, maybe 4 or 5 or more verses that relate to a time within the narrative that maybe take all of 15 minutes, right? And then maybe it moves us again. The narrator moves us somewhere off again, something else. So there's pacing that occurs, fast movement, slowing down, etc. All that is part of the storytelling technique, and also it's exceedingly significant that the purpose of the story are in the details, are in that slow narrative time, if you will. Okay? And that, connected with that, he'll mention later, is the concept of dialogue. And dialogue is exceedingly important because that's the primary way in which the biblical writers or storytellers depict characterization. It doesn't say very much about now Shamgar was, 6 feet tall, an Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of a physique, with blue eyes and black hair, and, it doesn't do any of that. Okay? It gives us a picture of Shamgar simply by characterization of what he did, if you will. But more often than not, it also gives us a picture through the dialogue, through talking to one another, if you will. And typically, there's only 2 people that talk in these dialogues. It's not a 3-way conversation, it's a 2-way deal. Almost 100% of the time, if not 100% of the time. And what that's doing is describing various kinds of characters, and that you're only going to get it through the dialogue, and through the syntax, and through the nature of the writing, and through the pacing and all of that. Okay? You'll see that in each one of your stories. Okay? You'll see some of that. So that's it. Point of view, it says there's 4 points of view you can have here. You call them 73. You can have a spatial or space point of view, time, or psychological or ideological points of view. Right? So he defines spatial as identifying with the character, and more often than not through both the actions and speech. Doesn't describe them and give us a good overview of the individual. Of course, we understand what the temporal point of view would be. There's different time frames, where it's taking place. The time frame, as we had the other day, or last night, I guess it was, where that whole passage was. Exegesis, where that whole verse or two was just bringing us in time to the point at which the story begins again. You see, right? It's the perspective of that. And then we got the psychological point of view. Okay? In other words, what are people feeling? And it only comes about either through some action that might be expressed as not happy, he's killing somebody, or more often than not, though, it's through dialogue and through the